A woman lies half buried in the snow, her lips blue, whispering, "It hurts, down there too." A rugged mountain man kneels beside her, his hands trembling when he sees what's been done to her. Scars, burns, the mark of a cruel man's claim. He brings her to his cabin, lights a fire, and fights the storm to keep her alive. But mercy comes at a price. By dawn, a wanted notice is nailed to his door, a reward for the very woman he's saving. Now the snow isn't the only thing hunting them. Behind the judge's seal lies a secret that could burn the whole valley. In a land ruled by greed and fear, one man's faith will be tested against the kind of evil that wears a preacher's smile. Can compassion stand against corruption? And when the truth comes to light, will love be strong enough to heal what still hurts down there too? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The winter wind howled through the Gunnison Highlands like a wounded beast, driving needles of snow into Lorenzo McCrae's weathered face. He pulled his wool scarf higher, shielding his nose from the bitter cold as he trudged homeward through deepening drifts. The day's hunt had yielded nothing, not even rabbit tracks to follow. His worn leather pack hung empty against his back. The setting sun painted the snow-heavy clouds in shades of amber and blood, a storm-warning sky that made his bones ache. Lorenzo knew these mountains well enough to read their moods, and this one spelled trouble. Already the wind was picking up, driving the snow sideways in white sheets that cut visibility to mere yards. "Lord above," he muttered, automatically falling into the habit of prayer that had sustained him through lonelier days. "Guide my feet home before this storm takes full hold." The creek to his right ran silent beneath its armor of ice, its familiar voice muted by winter's grip. Lorenzo kept it in sight as he walked, using it as his guide in the dying light. The snow was falling faster now, thick flakes catching in his graying beard and melting against his neck. That's when he heard it, so faint he thought at first it was just the wind playing tricks. A voice, barely more than a whisper, carried on the gusts. "It hurts down there too." Lorenzo stopped dead in his tracks, straining his ears. Years of tracking had taught him to trust his instincts, and something in that voice raised the hair on the back of his neck. He turned slowly, scanning the white landscape. "Hello?" he called out, his deep voice carrying over the wind. "Someone out there?" The only answer was the moan of the storm, but Lorenzo was already moving, following his gut toward where he thought the sound had come from. Near the creek's edge, half hidden by a snowdrift, he spotted something dark against the white, a piece of cloth, perhaps. As he drew closer, his heart clenched. It wasn't just cloth, but a woman's shawl, torn and frozen. And beneath it, "Dear God in heaven," he breathed. A woman lay crumpled in the snow, her dark skin barely visible beneath the white powder already accumulating on her still form. Her eyes were closed, lips blue with cold, and one hand still clutched desperately at the ragged shawl. Lorenzo dropped to his knees beside her, quickly pressing fingers to her throat. There, a pulse, thready but present. He could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest, each breath a weak struggle against the cold. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" He gently brushed snow from her face. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with features that might have been beautiful, if not twisted in pain. Her skin felt like ice beneath his touch. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Another whispered sound escaped her lips, unintelligible this time. There was no time to waste. Lorenzo shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her as best he could, noting with growing concern how her clothes were soaked through with snow. He needed to get her warm, and fast. "I'm going to pick you up now," he warned, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "My cabin's not far." As carefully as he could, Lorenzo slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees. She was lighter than he expected, despite her wet clothes. As he lifted her, she let out a small cry of pain that cut straight to his heart. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Hold on just a little longer." The storm was reaching full fury now, the wind howling with renewed vigor as if determined to steal this fragile life from his arms. Lorenzo tucked her closer to his chest and began walking, his legs breaking trail through snow that was already knee-deep in places. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice rough with effort, "spare this woman's life. Guide us home safe through your storm. Don't let her die out here in the cold." The woman stirred slightly at the sound of his voice, her head turning weakly against his chest. Lorenzo kept talking, mixing prayer with encouragement as he fought his way through the deepening snow. His own body was beginning to shake with cold without his coat, but he hardly noticed. All that mattered was getting her to shelter. It felt like hours, but could only have been 20 minutes before the dark shape of his cabin emerged from the swirling white. Lorenzo had never been so grateful to see those rough-hewn logs and the promise of warmth they held. He managed to get the door open without dropping his burden, shouldering it wide and stepping into the blessed still of his home. The fire had burned low during his absence, but there were still glowing coals in the hearth. Quickly, he laid the woman on his bed, the only proper piece of furniture he owned besides a table and 2 chairs. In the dim light filtering through his single window, he could see her more clearly now, and what he saw made his throat tighten with anger. Her dress, though once fine, was torn and dirty. But worse were the marks visible where the fabric had ripped, angry welts and half-healed scars that could only have come from a whip. Some were fresh enough to be infected, angry red lines that spoke of recent cruelty. "What kind of monster?" he started to say, but cut himself off. Questions could wait. Right now, she needed help. Lorenzo moved quickly around the cabin, falling into the efficient patterns of survival he'd learned over years in the wilderness. He built up the fire, set his largest pot of water to boil, and gathered what few medical supplies he had: clean rags, a bottle of whiskey for disinfecting, and the tin of healing salve he'd traded for last summer. The woman's boots were frozen solid, and he had to cut them away carefully, dreading what he might find beneath. Her feet were dangerously cold, but not yet blackened with frostbite. A small mercy. He wrapped them in a warm blanket while he prepared to treat her other wounds. As he worked, she drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering words he couldn't quite catch. Her forehead was hot despite her cold extremities. Fever from the infected wounds, he guessed. "Hang on," he told her as he cleaned the worst of the cuts with whiskey-soaked cloth. "Just hang on." She whimpered at his touch, but didn't pull away. In her delirium, she whispered fragments that made his heart ache. "Please, no more. I'll be good." "You're safe now," Lorenzo assured her, though he wasn't sure she could understand. "No one's going to hurt you here." He worked through the night, tending her wounds, coaxing water between her cracked lips, and keeping the fire well fed. The storm raged outside, rattling the shutters and howling down the chimney, but inside the cabin was warm and quiet except for the woman's occasional murmurs and the soft crackle of the fire. As he watched her restless sleep, Lorenzo found himself praying more than he had in years, not the formal prayers of his childhood, but desperate, honest pleading. Since losing Sarah, he'd kept God at arm's length, nursing his grief like a wound that wouldn't heal. But something about this woman's suffering pierced through his carefully maintained walls. "Lord," he whispered, "I don't know why you led me to her, but please, help me keep her alive. Give me the wisdom to know what she needs, and—" He hesitated, then added, "Help me be worthy of this task you've set before me." The woman stirred at the sound of his voice, her face turning toward him, though her eyes remained closed. In the firelight, despite the pain etched on her features, there was something peaceful about her expression, as if even in her fever dreams, she knew she was no longer alone in the storm. Lorenzo settled into his chair beside the bed, prepared for a long night of vigilance. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the mountains, but within the cabin's walls, a fragile flame of hope had been kindled. Hope that this mysterious woman would survive. Hope that perhaps they had both been saved from more than just the winter's cold. He reached out and gently adjusted the blanket covering her shoulders, his calloused hand moving with surprising tenderness. "Rest easy," he murmured. "Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, you're safe now. I promise you that." The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars. Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving his patient's face as he prepared to wait out the night, watching over this stranger whom God had entrusted to his care. Dawn crept over the Colorado highlands like a timid creature, the storm's fury spent into stillness. Fresh snow lay deep around Lorenzo McRae's cabin, unmarked except for the trail he'd broken the night before. Inside, the fire had burned low again, and Lorenzo rose stiffly from his chair to feed it new life. He dozed fitfully through the night, waking at every sound from his patient. Now, in the pale morning light filtering through frost-rimed windows, he could better assess her condition. The fever still held her in its grip, but her breathing seemed steadier than before. Lorenzo moved quietly around the cabin, gathering what he needed. He set a pot of snow to melt for fresh water, and pulled dried meat and beans from his stores to make a simple broth. His own stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's failed hunt, but the woman's needs came first. As the broth simmered, he dampened a clean cloth and gently wiped the sweat from her brow. Her dark skin was still too warm, but not as burning hot as it had been in the night. Thank the Lord for small mercies. "Ma'am," he said softly, not expecting a response. "I've got some broth here, if you can take it." Her only answer was the slight rise and fall of her chest. Lorenzo carefully lifted her head, supporting it with one hand, while he brought a spoonful of broth to her lips with the other. Some of the liquid trickled into her mouth, and he was relieved to see her swallow reflexively. "That's it," he encouraged, though she couldn't hear him. "Just a little more." He continued this way, patient and gentle, until she'd taken perhaps half a cup of the broth. It wasn't much, but it was something. Setting the bowl aside, he turned his attention to her wounds. The morning light revealed what darkness had partially hidden, and Lorenzo's jaw tightened as he unwrapped the bandages he'd applied the night before. The welts across her legs and back were deliberate, methodical. Not the random marks of a moment's cruelty, but the systematic work of someone who'd meant to cause pain without killing. As he cleaned the wounds with warm water, his experienced eye caught something else, a brand burned into her shoulder. Though partially healed, the mark was clear enough. The distinctive B-bar-C that everyone in 3 counties knew belonged to Judge Silas, Baines's ranch. Lorenzo's hands stilled. He knew of Baines, everyone did. The judge was one of the most powerful men in the territory, respected and feared in equal measure. He was also known for his peculiar arrangements with his workers, especially those who'd been freed by the war, but found themselves trapped in new kinds of bondage. A sound from the bed interrupted his dark thoughts. The woman's eyes had opened, dark brown and wide with terror as she took in her unfamiliar surroundings. When she saw Lorenzo, She tried to push herself up, then fell back with a gasp of pain. "Easy now," Lorenzo said, keeping his voice low and calm. "You're safe here. I found you in the snow last night, brought you to my cabin. You were half frozen." She stared at him, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. Her gaze darted to the door, the windows, back to him, measuring distances, looking for escape routes. Lorenzo recognized the look. He'd seen it in trapped animals, in soldiers in ambush, in people who'd learned the hard way that safety was never certain. When she tried to speak, her voice was barely more than a whisper, rough from cold and fear. Who are you?" "Name's Lorenzo McRae. I'm a trapper, live up here alone." He stayed where he was, making no move toward her. "I mean you no harm, ma'am. Just want to help you heal up." She flinched when he shifted his weight, and he noticed her eyes fix on the knife at his belt. Without hesitation, Lorenzo slowly drew the knife and set it on the table, then stepped back. "No weapons," he said. "No threats. Just help if you'll take it." The woman watched him, still tense but with a hint of confusion now mixing with the fear. Lorenzo did the only thing he could think of. He knelt beside his bed, bowed his head, and began to pray. "Lord," he said quietly, "thank you for bringing this soul to my door last night. Thank you for helping her survive the cold. Please grant her peace and healing, and help her to know she's safe here. In your name, Amen." When he looked up, something had changed in her expression. The terror had eased, just slightly, replaced by a cautious wonder. "You pray?" she asked. Lorenzo nodded. "Not as often as I should, maybe. But yes." She seemed to struggle with herself for a moment, then whispered, "I prayed too, in the snow. Didn't think anyone heard." "He heard," Lorenzo said simply. "Led me right to you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. After a long moment, she spoke again, her voice stronger but still hesitant. "My name is Amara Holt." "Miss Holt," Lorenzo acknowledged with a slight nod. "Can you tell me what happened? How you came to be out in that storm?" She turned her face away, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her words came slowly, as if each one had to be dragged into the light. "I ran. From the ranch. Judge Baines's ranch." Her hands clutched at the blanket. He owns people. Not legally, not anymore, but he finds ways. Debt, contracts we can't read, threats." Her voice broke. "I couldn't stay. Not after—" She trailed off, but the marks on her body told the rest of the story. Lorenzo felt a familiar shame rise in his throat. During his years as a cavalry scout, he'd seen too much injustice, too many times when the law protected the powerful and punished the vulnerable. He'd followed orders, kept his peace, told himself it wasn't his place to judge. "I understand if you need to take me back," Amara said quietly. "He'll be looking. He'll send men." "No," Lorenzo said, the word coming out harder than he'd intended. He softened his tone. "No, Miss Holt. I won't be taking you anywhere you don't want to go. Not now, not ever." She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. "Why? Why would you help me?" Lorenzo considered his answer carefully. "Because it's right. Because the Lord put you in my path. And because I've spent too many years watching evil happen and doing nothing about it." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Finally, Amara gave a small nod, and some of the tension left her body. She was still afraid. Lorenzo could see that, but something like hope had kindled in her eyes. As evening approached, Lorenzo stoked the fire and lit the lamp. Amara had drifted in and out of sleep throughout the day, taking more broth when she could. Her fever seemed to be breaking, but she was still weak from her ordeal. In the gathering darkness, Lorenzo retrieved something from his trunk. A Bible, its leather cover worn soft with use. Amara's eyes followed his movements as he settled into his chair. "This was my wife's," he said quietly. "Sarah's. She used to read from it every night." He ran his fingers over the familiar binding. "Would you mind if I read some now?" "Please," Amara whispered. Lorenzo opened the Bible to where a faded ribbon marked the Psalms. Sarah's favorite passage was there, the words nearly memorized. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." As he read, his deep voice filling the cabin with ancient words of comfort, he saw Amara's eyes close, not in fear this time but in peace. Her breathing grew steady and even. Lorenzo continued reading long after she'd fallen asleep, the familiar verses washing over them both like gentle rain. In the quiet of the cabin, with the last light fading outside and the fire casting warm shadows on the walls, he made a silent vow. This woman had been placed in his care, and he would protect her. Whatever came, whether Judge Baines's men or his own demons from the past, he would not fail her. It wasn't just about doing what was right anymore. It was about redemption for them both. Setting the Bible aside, Lorenzo added another log to the fire and settled in for another night's watch. Outside, the world was still and white, untouched by human footprints. For now at least, they were safe in this small haven of warmth and trust. Amara stirred, slightly in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't catch. But her face was peaceful now, the terror of the morning gone. Lorenzo pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders and resumed his vigil, grateful for this chance to be the kind of man Sarah had always believed he could be. Days passed like whispers in the cabin. The late winter sun cast long shadows through frosted windows, while Amara's body slowly mended. Lorenzo kept the fire burning steady, changed her bandages with gentle hands, and brought fresh snow to melt for drinking water. Each morning, he checked her fever, relieved to find it gradually subsiding. On the fourth day, Lorenzo sat at his workbench, carefully cutting strips of supple elk hide. Amara's boots had been beyond saving, destroyed by ice and her desperate flight through the wilderness. Her feet, though healing, would need protection. He worked methodically, using skills learned from both settlers and native traders over his years in the mountains. "What are you making?" Amara's voice was stronger now, though still quiet. Lorenzo held up the partially finished moccasin. "Shoes. Yours were—" He trailed off, not wanting to remind her of that night. "Thank you." The words were simple, but carried weight. She watched his hands work the leather, and he could sense questions forming behind her careful silence. "My grandmother taught me," he offered, answering before she could ask. "She learned from the Ute people when she first came to these mountains. Said store-bought boots weren't worth the leather they're made from. Not up here." A ghost of a smile touched Amara's lips. "My mother was a healer. She taught me about plants, which ones cure fever or ease pain. I used to help in her garden." Her voice caught slightly. "Before—" Lorenzo nodded, letting her keep her silence. He understood how some memories were too raw to speak aloud. Instead, he focused on his work, his calloused fingers pressing the awl through thick hide, creating neat holes for stitching. The afternoon light was fading when he finished the first moccasin. He'd added extra padding inside and reinforced the sole with an additional layer of hide. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep her feet warm and protected. "May I?" he asked, holding up the finished shoe. Amara hesitated, then nodded. Lorenzo approached slowly, telegraph each movement as he had since that first morning. He knelt beside the bed and carefully lifted her foot, noting how she tensed but didn't pull away. The moccasin fit well enough, though he made mental notes about adjustments needed for the second one. "It hurts," she whispered, so softly he almost missed it. "Down there, too." Lorenzo's hands stilled. The words were the same ones she'd spoken in her delirium that first night, but now they carried a different weight. He recognized the tone. It wasn't just physical pain she was speaking of. Some hurts went deeper than flesh and bone. He sat back on his heels, considering his response. "I know something about that kind of hurt," he said finally, his voice rough with memory. "Lost my Sarah 3 years back. Her and our unborn child." The confession hung in the air between them. Lorenzo hadn't spoken of it to anyone since the funeral, had carried the weight of that loss alone in his mountain solitude. But something about Amara's presence, her own wounded spirit, drew the words out. "What happened?" Her question was gentle, without demand. Lorenzo's hands worked at the leather, giving him something to focus on besides the ache in his chest. "Fever took them both. Spring flood had washed out the bridge to town. By the time I got the doctor here..." He shook his head. "Nothing to be done." "I'm sorry," Amara said softly. Coming from her, the words weren't just empty comfort. They carried understanding. She knew what it was to be helpless in the face of loss. "Sarah, she loved this cabin," Lorenzo continued, surprising himself. "Said it was like living closer to heaven up here. Used to read her Bible on the porch in summer, singing hymns to the mountains." He smiled at the memory, though it hurt. "She'd have wanted me to help you. Was always taking in strays herself. Injured birds, lost travelers, anyone who needed shelter." Amara's eyes filled with tears. "She sounds like she was a good woman. The best." Lorenzo stood, needing to move. "I'll get started on the other shoe tomorrow. Should have you walking proper by week's end." But Amara wasn't finished. "After she died, did you ever think about..." She struggled with the words. "About ending it?" Lorenzo turned back to face her, seeing the shadows in her eyes. "Yes," he admitted. "More than once, especially that first winter alone." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But Sarah, she believed in life, in hope, even when things seemed darkest. Ending it would have been like... He gestured helplessly, like saying her faith was wrong. Amara nodded slowly, understanding. "My mama used to say that too. That hope is God's gift to the suffering." Her voice strengthened slightly. "At the ranch, sometimes that was all I had left. Hope that someday..." When she didn't continue, Lorenzo said quietly, "You don't have to talk about it. Not unless you want to." "Thank you." She closed her eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "For everything." Lorenzo watched as she drifted into sleep, her breathing evening out. The cabin felt different now, changed by their shared confidences. The silence was no longer empty, but full of understanding. When he was certain she was deeply asleep, Lorenzo stepped outside into the gathering dark. The night air bit at his face, clean and sharp. Above, stars pierced the black sky like ice crystals, indifferent to human suffering. He'd stood under these same stars the night Sarah died, raging at God's silence. Now, looking up at their cold light, he felt something different. Purpose, perhaps, or the stirring of hope he'd thought long dead. "I'll keep her safe," he whispered to the stars, to Sarah's memory, to God. "Whatever comes, she won't face it alone." The wind picked up, carrying the distant howl of wolves. Lorenzo knew what that meant. The weather was turning again. Another storm approaching. He studied the horizon, gauging the clouds building in the west. They'd need more firewood before it hit. But for now, the cabin was warm, and Amara was sleeping peacefully. For now, that was enough. Lorenzo took one last look at the stars before heading back inside. He had promises to keep, and the night was long. Inside, he added wood to the fire, its light casting dancing shadows on the walls. Amara murmured something in her sleep but didn't wake. Lorenzo settled into his chair, pulled out Sarah's Bible, and began to read quietly by firelight. The familiar words brought comfort, as they always had. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read softly. "I shall not want." Outside, the wind continued to rise, but within the cabin's walls, 2 wounded souls had found a moment of peace. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was a beginning. Sometimes, Lorenzo reflected, that was all anyone could ask for, a chance to begin again. He read on through the night, keeping watch as the stars wheeled overhead and the promise he'd made echoed in his heart. Whatever storms were coming, whatever men might follow Amara's trail when the snow melted, they would face it together. That was what Sarah would have wanted. It was what he wanted too, he realized. Not just to protect Amara, but to help her find her way back to hope. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars. Lorenzo turned another page, his deep voice a quiet anchor in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they were safe. For now, that was enough. As the night deepened, Lorenzo found himself returning to Amara's words. "It hurts down there too." Yes, he thought, it did. The kind of hurt that went soul deep, that changed a person forever. But maybe, just maybe, sharing that hurt made it a little easier to bear. He'd carried his grief alone for so long, wearing it like armor against the world. Now, watching Amara sleep, he felt something shift inside him. Not healing, exactly, but the possibility of it. The wind rose higher, rattling the cabin's windows. Lorenzo added another log to the fire and settled back in his chair. Whatever the night brought, he would be ready. He had promises to keep, after all. To Amara, to Sarah's memory, and finally, perhaps, to himself. The late January sun cast long shadows across the snow as Lorenzo swung his axe. A week had passed since Amara first spoke of her deeper wounds, and the routine of caring for her had settled into something familiar. The steady rhythm of chopping wood helped clear his mind, each strike echoing off the mountainside. Amara's strength was returning slowly but surely. That morning, she had managed to stand on her own, gripping the back of a chair while he steadied her. The triumph in her eyes had been something to behold, a glimpse of the woman she must have been before Baines broke her down. Lorenzo paused to wipe sweat from his brow, despite the biting cold. The woodpile was growing nicely, but winter wouldn't release its grip for months yet. He gathered an armload of split logs, careful to listen for any unusual sounds. These days, he found himself more watchful, more alert to danger. The crunch of his boots in the snow marked his path back to the cabin. Something caught his eye as he approached, a splash of white against the weathered door that hadn't been there before. His steps slowed. The paper fluttered in the wind, held fast by a heavy iron nail. Lorenzo's heart jumped to his throat as he made out the bold letters across the top. Fugitive servant. Below that, in careful print, Amara Holt, $500 reward, dead or alive. The wood clattered from his arms. He ripped the notice from the door, hands trembling with rage. A detailed description followed. Height, build, distinguishing marks. They'd even included the brand. His stomach turned at how they'd reduced her to inventory. When he pushed open the door, Amara was standing by the window, supported by the wall. One look at his face told her everything. "They found me," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Lorenzo crossed to the fireplace and thrust the paper into the flames. "No one's found anything. he said firmly, watching the wanted poster curl and blacken. Some rider must have passed through, posting these everywhere. But Amara's eyes were wide with panic, her breath coming in short gasps. I have to go. I can't stay here. They'll kill you for helping me. You're not going anywhere. Lorenzo moved to check all the window shutters, making sure they were secure. You can barely walk yet. You don't understand. Her voice cracked. Judge Baines, he owns the law in these parts. He'll send men. They'll burn you out if they have to. Lorenzo turned from the windows, his jaw set. Then let them try. He crossed to the heavy door and threw the iron bar across it. But first, you need to tell me everything, the whole truth. Amara sank into a chair, trembling. I was born free, she began softly. My father was a union doctor, my mother a nurse. They taught me reading and healing. Her fingers twisted in her skirt. After they died of the fever, I took work at the judge's ranch as a housekeeper. He seemed kind at first, said he'd give me a fair wage. Lorenzo pulled up a chair, listening intently as she continued. But then came the papers, contracts I didn't understand, full of legal words. He said I owed him for room and board, for medicine when I took sick. The debt kept growing. When I tried to leave, her hand went unconsciously to the scars on her back. He kept you enslaved through false debt, Lorenzo said, understanding dawning. Even though it's against the law. Amara nodded. Who would believe me over him? He's a judge. I'm just... She swallowed hard. Property. You are not property. Lorenzo's voice was fierce. You're a free woman, and what he did was wrong. The law doesn't care what's wrong, Amara said bitterly. Only what's legal, and helping a fugitive servant is illegal. Then I reckon I'm an outlaw now too. Lorenzo stood and checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. And I've been studying on that judge's kind of law for a long time. The winter evening drew in around them, darkness gathering early. Lorenzo kept the lamp unlit, not wanting to risk its glow being seen from outside. They sat in the firelight, talking in low voices about what might come next. Suddenly, Amara stiffened. Listen. Lorenzo heard it too, the distant thunder of hoofbeats on the frozen trail. He moved swiftly to douse the fire, leaving only the faintest coals glowing. The rifle was solid in his hands as he took up position by the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. Amara pressed herself into the darkest corner, hardly breathing. The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of tack and the murmur of men's voices. Lorenzo's finger rested lightly on the trigger as shadows moved past the cabin. Waste of time up here. Tracks in the fresh snow. Check the trapper's place. The voices faded, carried away by the wind. Still, Lorenzo held his position, counting heartbeats until he was certain the riders had moved on. Only then did he lower the rifle and release the breath he'd been holding. They'll be back, Amara whispered from her corner. Yes. Lorenzo moved to rebuild the fire, keeping it small. But we'll be ready. As warmth slowly returned to the cabin, they began to plan. The wanted poster had changed everything. What had been a temporary shelter would need to become a fortress, at least until Amara was strong enough to travel. And after that, well, Lorenzo had learned long ago that sometimes a man had to choose between what was legal and what was right. He watched Amara as she dozed fitfully in her chair, exhausted by fear and memories. The firelight caught the determination in her face, even in sleep. She was no one's property, no matter what papers the judge might wave. Lorenzo had seen too much injustice in his cavalry days to stand by and watch it happen again. Outside, the wind picked up, erasing the tracks of the search party. Tomorrow they would need to be more careful. No smoke during the day, no movement outside that might be seen. But for now, They were safe in the darkness of the cabin. Two outlaws bound together by circumstance and something deeper, a shared understanding of loss, and perhaps a growing hope. Lorenzo checked the rifle one more time before settling in for a long night's watch. The wanted poster might have made him an outlaw, but he reckoned some laws needed breaking. Sarah would have understood that. She'd always said a person's true character showed in how they treated those who needed help. The night deepened around them, full of waiting. But Lorenzo McRae had learned patience in these mountains. Whatever came with the dawn, he would be ready. Some fights were worth the cost, and this one had chosen him the moment he heard that cry in the snow. By the dying firelight, he watched Amara sleep, her face finally peaceful. The judge's men would return, that was certain, but they would find more than they bargained for up here in the highlands. Lorenzo settled deeper into his chair, rifle across his knees, and prepared for another sleepless night. The wind continued to howl outside, nature's own lullaby for the fugitives within. But there would be no real rest tonight, not with the weight of that wanted poster hanging over them. The game had changed, and the stakes were life itself. Yet somehow Lorenzo felt more alive than he had in years. Having something worth fighting for had a way of clearing a man's mind. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "if you're still listening, we could use some guidance about now." The only answer was the wind, but somehow that seemed enough. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, but for tonight, they were safe. For tonight, that had to be enough. The first pale light of dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-laden pines in shades of pearl and rose. Lorenzo stood at his cabin door, scanning the pristine white landscape for any sign of tracks or movement. The storm had done them a favor, erasing all evidence of yesterday's search party. "We need to move," he said quietly to Amara, who stood behind him wrapped in several layers of wool. "I know a place where you'll be safe while I fetch supplies." She nodded, clutching the shawl he'd given her tighter around her shoulders. The fever had broken days ago, but she still moved with careful slowness, each step measured against the pain of healing wounds. "Can you walk a few miles?" Lorenzo asked, studying her face with concern. "I have to," she answered simply. There was steel in her voice despite its softness. Lorenzo shouldered his pack, heavy with essential supplies, dried meat, matches, bandages, and an extra blanket. His rifle he would leave with her. The thought of going to town unarmed made his shoulders tense, but she would need protection more than he would. They set out as the sun cleared the ridge, Lorenzo breaking trail through knee-deep snow. He kept their pace slow, watching Amara for signs of fatigue. The wind had died down overnight, leaving the world eerily silent except for the crunch of their boots and their labored breathing in the thin mountain air. After an hour, they reached the first landmark Lorenzo had in mind, a towering granite outcrop that looked like a bear's head in profile. Here he turned them east, following a nearly invisible game trail that wound between ancient pines. Their branches hung low with snow, creating natural archways they had to duck beneath. "Not much further now," Lorenzo encouraged, noting how Amara's breath was coming in sharp gasps. She didn't complain, but he could see the toll the journey was taking. The cave entrance appeared suddenly, a dark slash in a gray rock face, partially hidden by a curtain of ice. Lorenzo had discovered it years ago while tracking a wounded elk. It had served as an emergency shelter more than once during sudden storms. "It ain't much," he said, helping Amara navigate the slight scramble up to the entrance. "But it's dry and well hidden. No one knows about it except me and maybe a few old mountain men who've long since moved on." Inside, the cave opened into a space about twice the size of his cabin's main room. The ceiling rose high enough to stand comfortably, and a natural chimney in the back would draw smoke up and out through a hidden crack in the mountainside. Previous occupants had left a crude stone fireplace and even a stack of old firewood against one wall. Lorenzo quickly got a small fire going, its light revealing crude pictographs on the walls, hunting scenes and spirit animals painted by people long gone. Amara touched one reverently, tracing the outline of a leaping deer with her fingertip. "This is a sacred place," she whispered. "Aye," Lorenzo agreed. "And it'll keep you safe while I ride to town." He shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, but she pulled it close, inhaling the leather and wood smoke scent that clung to it. "The rifle's loaded," he explained, propping it carefully against the wall near where she stood. "You remember how I showed you to use it?" Amara nodded. During the week in his cabin, he'd taught her the basics of handling the weapon, though she'd never fired it. "Pull the hammer back, aim steady, squeeze don't pull," she recited. "That's right." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be back before dark, if I ain't." He left the sentence unfinished. "How will you manage in town without your coat?" she asked, concerned. "Got another in my saddlebags. Not as warm, but it'll do." He busied himself arranging the supplies he'd brought, setting up a small camp for her. "There's enough food here for 3 days, though I aim to be back tonight. Keep the fire small. The smoke's near invisible from outside, but better safe than sorry." Amara watched him work, her dark eyes troubled. "It's not right you risking yourself like this. If they catch you helping me, then they catch me." Lorenzo straightened up, meeting her gaze steadily. "But they won't. I know these mountains better than any of the judge's men, and I've got old Gus to carry me. That mule may be stubborn, but he's sure-footed as they come." As if preparing to leave, he moved toward the cave entrance, but Amara's hand shot out suddenly, catching his. The touch was light as a feather, but it stopped him in his tracks. It was the first time she'd reached for him without fear or necessity. "Thank you," she said simply, her fingers warm against his weathered skin. "For everything." Lorenzo's throat tightened. He managed a nod, not trusting his voice, and gently squeezed her hand before letting go. Without looking back, he ducked through the cave entrance and began the careful descent to where he'd left Gus, tethered among the trees. The old mule greeted him with a soft whicker, breath steaming in the cold air. Lorenzo checked the saddle girth and mounted up, pointing Gus's nose toward town. The snow was still falling, light and steady, which would help cover their tracks. The journey down from the highlands took nearly 3 hours. Lorenzo kept Gus to a steady pace, not wanting to risk a misstep on the treacherous trail. As they descended, the air grew slightly warmer, the snow turning to sleet and then a cold rain. The town of Gunnison sprawled along the river valley, a collection of wooden buildings and muddy streets. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the telegraph wire hummed in the wind. Lorenzo tied Gus outside the mercantile, taking a moment to straighten his spare coat and pull his hat low over his eyes. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. The store was warm after the cold outside, smelling of coffee, leather, and tobacco. A group of men huddled near the pot-bellied stove, their voices low but carrying in the quiet space. "Offering $500 now," one was saying. "Dead or alive," the notice said. "Ain't right," another replied. "Woman like that, running in this weather. She'll freeze for sure." "Judge says she stole from him. Forged papers, took money from the safe." Lorenzo kept his back turned, pretending to study a display of canned goods. His hand clenched around a tin of peaches, but he forced himself to relax, to move naturally as he gathered supplies: coffee, flour, salt, matches. Heard tell she was more than just a servant, a third voice added, with ugly insinuation. "If you take my meaning." "Hush up," the storekeeper interrupted. "This ain't that kind of establishment. You want to gossip? Take it to the saloon." Lorenzo carried his purchases to the counter, keeping his face turned slightly away. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice was steady as he paid for the goods. The storekeeper, Mr. Jenkins, had known him for years, but today the man seemed distracted, barely glancing his way. As he loaded the supplies into his saddlebags, Lorenzo's mind raced. The judge was telling lies about Amara, trying to justify his hunt. But somewhere in that courthouse would be the real papers, the false contracts he'd used to enslave her. If they could get proof of his deception. Gus's ears suddenly pricked forward, and Lorenzo heard the distinctive jingle of cavalry gear. A patrol of mounted men was coming down the street, their blue uniforms stark against the gray day. Leading them was a man Lorenzo recognized, Captain Walsh, who'd been his commanding officer years ago. Lorenzo swung into the saddle, turning Gus's head toward home before the patrol could reach him. But he'd seen enough. The judge had called in federal troops, which meant he was worried. Worried enough to want this over quickly, before someone started asking too many questions. As he rode out of town, Lorenzo's mind was already working on a plan. He'd need help, someone who could access the courthouse records. And he knew just the person, if she was willing to risk it. Sarah's sister worked as a clerk for the county registry. She'd never approved of Lorenzo's marriage to her sister, but she had a strong sense of justice. The snow began falling again as he guided Gus up into the highlands. Lorenzo hunched deeper into his inadequate coat, thinking of Amara waiting in the cave, wrapped in his better one. He'd get proof of her freedom or die trying. Some battles were worth any cost, and this one had chosen him the moment he heard that cry in the snow. The journey back up took longer than the descent, Gus laboring against the steep trail and thickening snow. But the old mule was steady, placing each hoof with careful precision. Lorenzo let him set the pace, knowing they'd reach the cave eventually. Right now, being careful was more important than being quick. His thoughts kept returning to Amara's touch on his hand that morning, that moment of trust freely given. It had been so long since anyone had reached for him that way, without need or obligation. The memory warmed him more than any coat could have done, carrying him up the mountain through wind and snow toward whatever tomorrow might bring. The general store's warmth wrapped around Lorenzo as he stepped back inside. He had forgotten his gloves and needed them for the ride home. The same group of men still huddled by the stove, but they paid him no mind now, absorbed in a game of checkers. Mrs. Eleanor Callahan stood at the counter, her gray-streaked hair tucked neatly beneath a wool bonnet. She was selecting dried herbs, her movements careful and deliberate. As Lorenzo approached, she glanced up, then quickly away, but not before he caught the slight nod of recognition. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat. "Good day to you," she replied, her voice equally soft. She turned slightly, shielding her actions from view of the others as she sorted through bundles of dried mint and chamomile. Her left hand slipped beneath her shawl, emerging with a folded piece of paper. "The gloves you ordered came in," she said, loud enough for anyone to hear. Then, barely above a whisper, from her father. Lorenzo's heart skipped a beat. He reached for the paper, trying to keep his movements casual. Their fingers brushed as Mrs. Callahan passed him both the letter and a pair of work gloves. Her eyes met his briefly, full of meaning. "Much obliged," he said, tucking both items into his coat. He started to turn away, but she spoke again, voice pitched for his ears, alone. "The original record. It's in the courthouse vault. Judge Baines keeps it under lock and key." She selected another bundle of herbs. "Be careful, Mr. McRae. The judge has eyes everywhere, Lorenzo nodded slightly, paid for the gloves, and walked out. His mind raced as he mounted Gus. A freedom document, actual proof that Amara was a free woman, but locked away where they couldn't reach it. Still, it was more hope than they'd had this morning. The ride back to the cave seemed to take forever. The snow had stopped, but the wind cut like a knife through his lighter coat. Lorenzo barely felt it, his thoughts consumed with the letter in his pocket and what it might mean for Amara. The sun was lowering behind the mountains when he finally reached the hidden trail to the cave. He led Gus carefully between the rocks, following markers only he would recognize. A bent branch here, a certain pattern of stones there. At the cave entrance, he whistled softly, the signal they'd agreed upon. After a moment, Amara's face appeared in the shadows. "It's safe," she said, stepping back to let him enter. A tiny fire burned near the back of the cave, carefully placed so its light wouldn't show from outside. The space was warmer than he'd expected, and tidier too. Amara had arranged their few supplies with careful precision, making the most of what they had. "I brought more food," Lorenzo said, shrugging off his saddlebags. "And something else." He reached into his coat and withdrew the folded paper. Amara looked at it curiously. "What is that?" "A letter. From Mrs. Callahan." He held it out to her. "She says, 'It's from your father.'" Amara's hands trembled as she took the paper. She sank down beside the fire, unfolding it carefully. The firelight flickered across her face as she read, casting shadows that made her look both younger and older at once. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. "It's his writing," she whispered. "I'd know it anywhere." Her voice caught. "He certified my freedom. Right here, in his own hand. Says I was born to free parents, that he was a union doctor, and my mama was a nurse in the war hospitals." Lorenzo knelt beside her, careful to give her space. "Mrs. Callahan says there's an official record, too, in the courthouse vault." "The judge," Amara said bitterly. "He must have hidden it when Papa died. Made me think I had no proof, no rights." She pressed the letter to her heart, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "All these years." "We'll get that record," Lorenzo said firmly. "Whatever it takes. That proof exists, and now we know where to find it." Amara looked up at him through tear-filled eyes. "It's too dangerous. The vault will be guarded. And even if we got in, the judge would know it was me. He'd never stop hunting us." "Let him hunt," Lorenzo said. "A man like that, hiding truth and twisting law, he's bound to fall eventually. Maybe this'll be what brings him down." He added another small piece of wood to the fire. "Besides, we don't have to do it alone. Mrs. Callahan's willing to help, and I expect others would too if they knew the truth." Amara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Why do you risk so much? For a stranger?" Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance. "When I was with the cavalry," he finally said, "I saw too many times when good people stayed quiet while wrong was done. Told myself it wasn't my business, wasn't my place to speak up." He met her gaze steadily. "Not doing that again. Some things are worth any risk." Amara touched the letter again, tracing her father's signature with gentle fingers. "He believed that too. Used to say that truth and justice were like water. They'd find a way through any barrier if you just kept working at it. Wise man, your father." "He was." Amara carefully refolded the letter. "I miss him so much. But having his words again, knowing he made sure to leave proof of my freedom, it helps, like he's still watching over me somehow." Lorenzo nodded. "Hold on to that feeling. We'll need that kind of faith to get through what's coming." He pulled out the supplies he'd brought: bread, cheese, dried meat, and a small pot of honey. "For now, though, you need to eat. Keep up your strength." They shared a simple meal by the fire, speaking little but comfortable in the silence. The wind outside had died down, leaving only the soft crackle of flames and occasional snuffle from where Gus was tethered in a sheltered corner. As darkness settled fully outside, Lorenzo watched Amara read her father's letter again by firelight. Her face was softer now, the fear and tension eased by this tangible connection to her past. She was beautiful, he realized suddenly, not just in features, but in the quiet strength that showed through her suffering. The thought startled him, and he quickly looked away. His job was to protect her, to help her prove her freedom. Nothing more. He had no right to notice such things, not when she depended on him for safety. "I should check the perimeter before full dark," he said, standing. "Make sure no one's following our trail." Amara nodded, still absorbed in the letter. "Be careful," she said softly, not looking up. Outside, Lorenzo walked a wide circle around the cave entrance, checking for any sign they'd been discovered. But the growing darkness revealed nothing suspicious. No fresh tracks, no broken branches, no hint that anyone else had passed this way. He paused at the edge of a small cliff, looking down over the valley. Somewhere down there, in the courthouse vault, lay the proof that could set Amara truly free. The question was, how to get it. The building would be guarded, the vault locked tight. And even if they managed to break in, they'd need to know exactly where to look. Mrs. Callahan might be able to help with that last part. But the rest? Lorenzo sighed, his breath fogging in the cold air. They'd need a plan. A good one. Because if they tried and failed, they'd lose any chance of ever trying again. But they had hope now. Real hope, not just desperate wishing. They had proof that the document existed, and they knew where to find it. Sometimes, that was all you needed to start with. Everything else could follow from there. Lorenzo turned back toward the cave, where a faint warmth beckoned. Tomorrow they could start planning. Tonight was for rest, for letting Amara find comfort in her father's words, for gathering strength for the challenges ahead. As he ducked back into the cave, Amara looked up from the letter. The firelight caught tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. A real smile, perhaps her first since he'd found her in the snow. "All quiet?" she asked. "All quiet," he confirmed, settling down across the fire from her. "Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to get that record." Amara carefully tucked the letter into the pocket of his coat that she still wore. "Tomorrow," she agreed softly. "Thank you, Lorenzo, for everything." He just nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Instead, he fed another small piece of wood to the fire and watched the flames dance, carrying their shadows high up the cave wall into the darkness. Lorenzo studied the darkening sky through the cave entrance, his weathered face creasing with concern. Heavy clouds rolled over the mountains like waves of slate-gray wool, promising more snow. The wind carried that sharp bite he'd learned to recognize. A storm was coming, and soon. Inside the cave, Amara sat cross-legged by the small fire, mending a tear in her skirt with careful stitches. She'd grown stronger over the past days, though her limp remained, a constant reminder of what she'd endured. "Storm's brewing," Lorenzo said, ducking back inside. "We need to move soon, before the passes fill with snow. But first, I need to see someone, an old friend who knows these mountains better than any man alive." Amara looked up from her sewing. "Who?" "Henry, a Ute scout I knew from my cavalry days. If anyone can guide us safely to Gunnison, it's him." Lorenzo began gathering their few supplies. "I'll ride out to his camp today, see if he'll help." "I'm coming with you," Amara said firmly, setting aside her mending. Lorenzo shook his head. Too dangerous. Better you stay here where— No. Amara stood, straightening to her full height, despite her limp. I've spent too many years hiding, being told where to stay and when to move. I won't do it anymore. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. If we're going to face the judge, I want to face him on my feet, not cowering in a cave. Lorenzo opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He recognized that look, the same one his late wife Sarah had worn when she'd made up her mind about something. There'd be no swaying Amara now. All right, he said finally, but we'll need to keep you warm. He reached into his pack and pulled out an old buffalo coat, the fur still thick and dark. It ain't pretty, but it'll keep the cold out. Amara ran her fingers over the rough hide. Thank you, she said softly. The coat engulfed her when she put it on, but her smile was bright beneath the fur collar. They doused the fire and packed quickly, leaving no trace of their shelter. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving bitter needles of cold through their clothes. Lorenzo helped Amara mount behind him on Gus, who snorted at the extra weight, but held steady. The ride to Henry's camp took most of the morning. The Ute Scout had made his home in a protected valley, where a clear stream cut through stands of aspen and pine. Smoke rose from a small cabin. Henry had adopted some settler ways over the years, though Lorenzo knew he still kept a traditional lodge behind the cabin for ceremonies. Henry was outside chopping wood when they arrived, his long, gray-streaked hair tied back with a leather thong. He set down his axe as they approached, dark eyes taking in everything: Lorenzo's worried expression, Amara's buffalo coat, the storm clouds mounting overhead. Bad weather coming, Henry said by way of greeting. You didn't ride out here just to tell me that? Lorenzo dismounted, helping Amara down carefully. Need your help, old friend. We're heading to Gunnison. Need to get there before the passes close. Henry's gaze shifted to Amara, noting her limp and the way she held herself, proud but cautious, like someone used to expecting blows. Judge Baines's mark, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Amara's chin lifted. Not anymore. A slight smile touched Henry's weathered face. Good answer. He gestured toward the cabin. Come inside. We'll talk where it's warm. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable, with a pot of coffee keeping hot on the wood stove. Henry poured 3 cups while Lorenzo explained their situation: the hidden freedom papers, the judge's lies, their need to reach the courthouse before winter sealed the mountains. Henry listened in silence, occasionally nodding. When Lorenzo finished, the scout studied his coffee for a long moment before speaking. You're not just fighting a man, he said finally. You're fighting a sickness of the land. He looked at Amara. Men like the judge, they poison everything they touch, make others believe lies about who's worthy of freedom, who deserves to be treated as human. His voice held old pain. My people know this too well. Will you help us? Amara asked quietly. Henry set down his cup. Yes. There's a path through the high country. Dangerous in winter, but faster than the main road. We can be in Gunnison in 3 days, if the weather holds. He glanced out the window at the gathering clouds. Should leave tomorrow at first light. Thank you, Lorenzo said, relief evident in his voice. I know what I'm asking? Henry held up a hand. No need. Some fights are worth taking. He turned to Amara. You're sure about this? Once we start, there's no turning back. I'm sure. Amara's voice was firm. I won't spend another winter afraid. Henry nodded, respect showing in his eyes. Then we'll need supplies. Food, blankets, medicine in case that leg troubles you. He began moving around the cabin, gathering items into a pack. Lorenzo, help me check the horses. They'll need to be ready for rough country. Outside, as they inspected hooves and tightened saddle straps, Henry spoke quietly. She's stronger than she knows. Lorenzo nodded, adjusting Gus's bridle. Stronger than any of us, maybe. The judge won't expect that. Henry tested the girth on his own horse, a sturdy paint. He'll be looking for someone broken, someone running scared, not someone walking straight toward him. That's what worries me, Lorenzo admitted. If something happens to her, then we'll deal with it, Henry said firmly. But she's right. Hiding isn't the answer. Sometimes you have to stand and face the storm. He glanced at the sky. Speaking of which, we should get inside. This one's going to be rough. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey, checking supplies and studying Henry's hand-drawn map of the mountain passes. The storm hit just before sunset, howling around the cabin's walls like a wild thing. Inside, they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, listening to the wind. Amara sat close to the stove, the buffalo coat draped over her shoulders. She'd been quiet through dinner, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke. "When I was little," she said softly, "my father used to tell me stories about people who escaped slavery. He said the bravest ones weren't just running from something. They were running toward freedom, toward a future they could see even when everyone told them it was impossible." She touched the letter in her pocket. "I didn't understand then. I do now." Henry nodded. "Your father was wise. Running from fear only makes it stronger. Running toward hope." He smiled slightly. "That's different medicine altogether." Lorenzo watched Amara across the firelight, seeing how she sat straighter now, how the fear that had haunted her eyes was giving way to something else. Determination, maybe. Or hope. She caught him looking and smiled slightly, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Get some rest," Henry said, standing. "Tomorrow we ride into weather that would make wolves think twice. We'll need all our strength." That night, lying on his bedroll near the stove, Lorenzo listened to the storm and thought about courage. Not the showy kind that won battles or made legends, but the quiet kind that got up every morning and faced the day, no matter how hard it might be. The kind Amara showed just by refusing to hide anymore. He remembered Sarah saying once that true courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being afraid and doing what needed doing anyway. Watching Amara choose to face her fears head-on, he understood that better than ever. The storm raged through the night, but by dawn it had blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow and bitter cold. They set out as the sun cleared the mountains, breath frosting in the crystal air. Amara rode her own horse now, a gentle mare Henry had been keeping for a friend, wrapped in the buffalo coat against the chill. Lorenzo watched her as they started up the trail, noting how she sat straight in the saddle despite her limp, eyes fixed forward toward whatever lay ahead. She wasn't running anymore. She was riding toward something, toward a future she could finally see clearly. Henry took the lead, reading the trail with decades of experience, while Lorenzo brought up the rear. Between them, Amara rode steady and sure, the rising sun catching gold in her dark hair. The wind had died to a whisper, and in the pristine morning, even the daunting task ahead seemed somehow more manageable. They had a long way to go, and more storms would surely come. But for now, they rode together toward Gunnison, toward justice, toward hope. And somewhere ahead, through the mountain passes, lay the proof that could set Amara truly free, not just on paper, but in the eyes of the law and the world. The morning was cold, but the sun was rising, and they were on their way. The cold bit deeper with each passing hour. Wind howled through the mountain passes, driving needle-sharp ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. Their breath froze in their scarves, creating masks of frost that had to be periodically broken away. The horses plodded forward, heads low against the bitter gale. Henry led them along a narrow trail that hugged the mountainside. Below, a creek churned black between snow-crusted banks. Lorenzo kept one eye on Amara, watching for signs of fatigue, but she rode steady and straight despite the punishing conditions. "Creek's rising," Henry called back, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Need to ford before the ice breaks up completely." Lorenzo studied the water with concern. The creek was maybe 30 feet across, its surface a dangerous mix of open water and shifting ice. But Henry was right. Waiting could make it impossible to cross at all. They dismounted at the ford, leading the horses one at a time. Henry went first, testing each step with his staff, finding the safest path across. The icy water swirled around his horses' legs as they picked their way between partially submerged boulders. Amara followed, her mare trembling but staying calm under her gentle guidance. Lorenzo brought up the rear with Gus, who snorted unhappily at the cold water. Halfway across, Lorenzo's boot slipped on a snow-slick rock. He grabbed for Gus's reins with his bare right hand, plunging it into the freezing creek. By the time they reached the far bank, Lorenzo could barely feel his fingers. He tried to tie Gus's reins, but his hand wouldn't work right. The skin had gone waxy white, dangerous with frostbite. "Here," Amara said quietly, taking the reins from him. She led both their horses to where Henry had already started gathering wood for a fire. "Sit. Let me see your hand." Lorenzo didn't argue. The pain was starting to set in as feeling returned. Sharp, burning needles that made him clench his jaw. Amara knelt beside him, taking his injured hand between both of hers. Her touch was gentle but sure as she examined his fingers. "Not too deep yet," she murmured, "but we need to warm it slowly." She pulled a clean cloth from her saddlebag and soaked it in melted snow, wrapping it carefully around his hand. "Hold it close to your body, under your coat. The heat needs to come back gradually." Lorenzo did as she instructed, watching as she moved to help Henry with the fire. Her limp was more pronounced after the difficult crossing, but she worked efficiently, gathering smaller twigs for kindling while Henry split larger logs with his hatchet. Soon they had a decent blaze going, and Amara insisted Lorenzo sit close to it while she prepared a poultice of herbs from her medicine pouch. The warmth began to seep back into his fingers, bringing waves of pain that made him sweat despite the cold. "My mother taught me about healing," Amara said softly as she worked. "She was a nurse during the war. Said knowing how to ease suffering was as important as knowing how to fix bones." She bound his hand with gentle efficiency, her dark fingers steady against his pale skin. "Thank you," Lorenzo managed through gritted teeth. The pain was fierce now, but he could feel his fingers again. A good sign. "Rest," she told him firmly. "I'll see to the horses." As dusk gathered, they made camp in a sheltered hollow. Henry ranged out to check their back trail while Amara prepared a simple supper of beans and dried meat. The wind had died down some, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the crack and pop of their fire. After they'd eaten, Amara began to hum softly, a familiar tune that made Lorenzo's chest tighten. Then she began to sing, her voice clear and sweet in the gathering dark. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Lorenzo's throat closed up. Sarah had loved that hymn, had sung it while working in their little cabin, while tending her garden, while rocking in the chair he'd made her as she dreamed of the baby that would never be born. He hadn't heard it since burying them both. Tears rolled down his cheeks, freezing before they could fall. He didn't try to hide them. Amara's voice carried the melody gently, like a mother soothing a child, and something that had been frozen inside him for years began to thaw. "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed." The hymn drifted into silence. Lorenzo stared into the fire, aware of Amara's quiet presence beside him, of Henry's respectful distance as he kept watch. No one spoke. No one needed to. Finally, Lorenzo cleared his throat. "Sarah, my wife, she used to sing that every Sunday morning while she made breakfast." He touched his bandaged hand absently. "Haven't heard it since you lost her," Amara finished softly. "Sometimes a song can hold more memory than words." Lorenzo nodded, unable to speak again. But the tears that came now weren't just grief. There was something else. Something like release. Like mercy. They sat in companionable silence until Henry returned, moving like a shadow through the darkness. His expression was grave. "Riders," he reported quietly. 6, maybe 7, near the judge's north pasture, following our trail, but the snows confused them some." He crouched by the fire, warming his hands. "They'll be watching the main paths to town." "Options?" Lorenzo asked, forcing himself to focus on the immediate threat. Henry pulled out his crude map, drawing lines in the dirt with a stick. "There's a canyon cuts through here. Narrow, hard to spot unless you know where to look. Dangerous in winter, but it'll get us around Baines's holdings without being seen." "How dangerous?" Amara asked. "Steep walls, loose rock. Ice makes it tricky, but I've used it before when I needed to move quiet." Henry glanced at her leg. "Can you manage it?" "Yes." No hesitation in her voice. "Rather face the canyon than the judge's men." They broke camp before dawn, erasing all signs of their presence. The canyon entrance was just as Henry described, a barely visible crack in the rock face, easy to miss if you didn't know what to look for. They had to dismount and lead the horses single file between the towering walls. The footing was treacherous. Ice coated many of the rocks, and loose scree shifted underfoot. They moved slowly, carefully, every step considered. Lorenzo's bandaged hand ached in the cold, but Amara's poultice had done its work. He could use his fingers again. They were halfway through when Henry froze, holding up a hand for silence. Far above, at the canyon's rim, came the sound of hooves and voices. Everyone pressed close to the canyon wall, hardly daring to breathe. A shower of pebbles rattled down as riders passed overhead. "Must have gone south," a voice drifted down. "Check the river crossing." The sounds faded. They waited several more minutes before moving on, even more cautious now. When they finally emerged from the canyon's far end, the sun was high, and their clothes were soaked with nervous sweat despite the cold. "They'll waste time checking the river," Henry said with satisfaction. "That should give us the lead we need." Lorenzo noticed Amara was trembling slightly. Without a word, he draped his extra blanket over her shoulders. She gave him a grateful look, then reached out to squeeze his injured hand gently through its bandages. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." Lorenzo felt something stir in his chest, something he'd thought had died with Sarah. Not love, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it, the capacity for it. He'd been so focused on survival, on duty, on making it through each day, he'd forgotten there could be more. He looked at this woman who had endured so much, yet still had kindness to give, who could sing hymns of grace even after knowing such cruelty, who had bound his wounds with the same gentle hands that were now rebuilding his faith in something larger than grief. Henry was checking their horses, giving them a moment of privacy. Lorenzo cleared his throat. "No need for thanks," he said roughly. "What you've given me, it's worth more than anything I could do." Amara's eyes were bright with understanding. She nodded once, then turned to mount her horse. They still had far to go, and the day was wearing on. But as they rode out of the canyon's shadow, Lorenzo felt lighter somehow. Like a burden he'd carried so long, he'd forgotten it was there had finally begun to lift. The wind was picking up again, but this time it felt more like promise than punishment. They rode on toward Gunnison, toward whatever waited there, but Lorenzo was no longer just running from the past. Like Amara, he was riding toward something too, toward hope, toward healing, toward life. The journey to Gunnison took 3 hard days. They kept to the back trails, avoiding the main roads where Judge Baines's men might be watching. Lorenzo's injured hand had begun to heal thanks to Amara's careful tending, though it still ached in the bitter cold. Henry led them through hidden passes and along frozen creek beds, his knowledge of the land proving invaluable. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Gunnison, the sight below made them pull their horses to a sudden halt. The courthouse, their destination and hope for justice, stood as a blackened skeleton against the gray winter sky. Charred timbers reached up like accusing fingers, and wisps of smoke still curled from the ruins despite the recent snow. "No," Amara whispered, her voice breaking. "No, please." Lorenzo exchanged a grim look with Henry. This was no accident. The timing was too convenient, the target too specific. Judge Baines had known they would come for the proof of Amara's freedom, and he had acted first. "We still have to try," Lorenzo said quietly. Maybe something survived. They rode down into town carefully, keeping to the shadows of buildings where possible. The streets were quiet in the late afternoon, with only a few people hurrying about their business. No one paid much attention to 3 dusty travelers, though Lorenzo noticed how Amara pulled her scarf higher to cover her face. The courthouse steps were slick with ice formed from the water used to fight the fire. Yellow rope marked off the entrance, but no guards stood watch. Henry stayed with the horses while Lorenzo and Amara ducked under the rope and entered through the broken doors. The smell hit them first, wet ash and charred wood, mixed with the acrid scent of burned paper. Their boots crunched on debris as they moved through what had been the main hall. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, casting weird shadows through the hanging smoke. "The records room was in the back," Amara whispered, pointing to a partially collapsed doorway. "Father said they kept important documents in a steel lockbox." Lorenzo nodded, already moving forward. The floor creaked ominously under their weight. He tested each step before putting his full weight down, aware that the fire might have weakened the boards. Behind him, Amara picked her way carefully through the wreckage, her breath coming in short, anxious gasps. The records room was a disaster. File cabinets lay toppled and bent from the heat, their contents reduced to ash. Drawers had been pulled out and scattered, whether by the fire or by someone searching before them, Lorenzo couldn't tell. But he got to work immediately, shifting through the debris while Amara searched the other side of the room. Minutes stretched into an hour as they dug through the ruins. Lorenzo's hands were black with soot, his injured fingers protesting the rough work. But he kept going, driven by the desperate hope in Amara's eyes each time she looked his way. Finally, beneath an overturned desk, he found it, a steel lockbox, its surface scorched but intact. "Here," he called softly. Amara hurried over as he worked the simple latch. The box hadn't been locked, another bad sign. His heart sinking, Lorenzo opened the lid. Empty. The box was completely empty except for a few scraps of burned paper too small to read. Amara sagged against him, a small sound of despair escaping her lips. Lorenzo put an arm around her shoulders, steadying her. "We'll find another way," he promised, though he had no idea how. A sudden noise made them both freeze. Footsteps on the creaking floor behind them. "Well, look who we have here." They turned slowly. A deputy stood in the doorway, his badge glinting dully in the smoky light. His eyes were fixed on Amara's face, widening with recognition. "You're that runaway the judge is looking for," he said, starting to back away. "Don't move! I'm getting the sheriff!" Lorenzo's revolver seemed to leap into his hand of its own accord. "Stop right there." The deputy froze, then slowly raised his hands. "You don't want to do this, mister. Shooting a lawman will get you hanged." Lorenzo's hand was steady, but his mind raced. He couldn't shoot an unarmed man. It went against everything he believed. But if he let the deputy go... In that moment of hesitation, the deputy turned and ran. His boots thundered on the wooden floor as he shouted, "Help! In the courthouse! The runaway!" "Run!" Lorenzo grabbed Amara's hand and they burst out of the records room. The main hall seemed endless, debris catching at their feet as they sprinted for the entrance. Outside, they could hear shouts and running feet as people responded to the deputy's calls. They exploded out onto the courthouse steps, just as Henry rode up leading their horses. Lorenzo practically threw Amara into her saddle, then swung up onto his own mount. A bullet cracked past his ear as they wheeled the horses around. More shots followed as they galloped down the street. Lorenzo kept low over his horse's neck, feeling the animal's muscles bunch and stretch beneath him. Beside him, Amara rode just as skillfully, her face set with determination. Henry led them down an alley, then another, working to break the line of sight with their pursuers. The sound of hoofbeats behind them grew louder, mounted men joining the chase. Bullets continued to whine past or thud into buildings around them. Lorenzo still hadn't fired back, his revolver heavy in its holster. He wouldn't shoot men doing their duty, even if that duty served an evil purpose. They burst out of town heading north, snow flying from their horses' hooves. The pursuit was close behind, but Henry knew these trails better than anyone. He led them into a grove of pine trees, where the branches whipped at their faces, but helped break up their trail. The gunfire gradually fell behind as they pushed their horses harder, putting distance between themselves and Gunnison. They rode until the sun began to set, and their mounts were blowing hard, then finally slowed to a walk. When Lorenzo looked back, he could no longer see any sign of pursuit, but he could see the smoke from the courthouse still rising against the darkening sky, a monument to destroyed hope and corrupt power. Amara rode beside him in silence, her face streaked with tears and soot. All their planning, all their careful preparation had come to nothing. The proof of her freedom was ashes, and now they were truly fugitives, Lorenzo and Henry as much as her. "I'm sorry," Lorenzo said softly. "I should have known he'd do something like this." "Not your fault," Amara replied, her voice rough but steady. "Judge Baines has been destroying evidence of his crimes for years. I should have expected it." She straightened in her saddle, lifting her chin. "But he can't burn the truth. I am free, no matter what his papers say or don't say." Henry had been scanning the trail ahead. Now he turned back to them. "We should keep moving. They'll have telegraphed ahead to other towns by now." Lorenzo nodded grimly. They were outlaws now, all of them. The judge's influence reached far, and his lies would travel faster than the truth. But looking at Amara's determined face in the gathering dusk, Lorenzo felt no regret. Some things were worth becoming an outlaw for. They rode on as night fell, the sound of their horses' hooves muffled by fresh snow. Behind them, the echo of gunfire still seemed to hang in the air, along with the ashy smell of destroyed hopes. but ahead. Ahead lay something else. Not what they had planned or hoped for, but something they would face together. The winter stars emerged one by one, above them, cold and distant. Somewhere in that vast darkness, Lorenzo thought, there had to be another way. They just had to find it. The line shack crouched against the mountainside like a wounded animal, its weathered boards gray with age. Lorenzo helped Amara down from her horse, steadying her when she stumbled on legs stiff from riding. The door creaked open at his touch, revealing a single room thick with dust and shadows. "It ain't much," Lorenzo said softly, "but it'll keep us out of sight for now." He struck a match, touching it to a stubby candle he found on the crude wooden shelf. The flame cast wavering light across rough-hewn walls and a sagging cot in one corner. Amara sank onto an overturned crate, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. In the candlelight, the shadows under her eyes looked like bruises. "I should never have let you do this," she whispered. "Any of it. Now you're both wanted men because of me." Lorenzo knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. They were still black with soot from the courthouse. "No," he said firmly. "Don't you carry that burden. What happened back there, that was Baines's doing, not yours." "But your life," her voice broke. "Everything you built wasn't worth much without doing what's right." Lorenzo's voice was gentle but firm. "I've spent too many years looking the other way when evil men did evil things. Not anymore." Henry moved quietly around the small space, checking the walls for gaps and the single window for sight lines. "We should be safe here for tonight," he said. "This place has been abandoned since last summer. Nobody comes up this way much." Lorenzo nodded, still holding Amara's hands. "God didn't lead us this far to abandon us now," he said. The words surprised him. He hadn't spoken of faith much since Sarah died, but looking at Amara's face, seeing the mix of fear and hope there, he knew they were true. She drew a shaky breath. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen his hand in this from the start." Lorenzo squeezed her fingers gently. "Finding you in that storm wasn't chance. Neither was Mrs. Callahan having that letter, or Henry being willing to help. God's been guiding us, even when we couldn't see it." Tears spilled down Amara's cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the soot. "I want to believe that," she whispered, "but I'm so afraid." Lorenzo reached up, hesitating just a moment before wiping away one of her tears with his thumb. "Fear ain't wrong," he said softly, "but it ain't all there is either." Henry had been watching this exchange with quiet attention. Now he moved toward the door. "I'll take first watch," he said. "You both need rest." Lorenzo started to protest, but Henry held up a hand. "You've barely slept in 3 days, brother. Rest now. I'll wake you if anything moves out there." Exhaustion hit Lorenzo like a physical blow as soon as Henry mentioned sleep. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd truly rested. Even before they'd left for Gunnison, he'd spent nights watching over Amara as she healed, counting her breaths in the darkness. He helped Amara onto the cot, draping his coat over her when she shivered. The night was growing bitter cold, winter reasserting itself after the brief thaw that had allowed their journey to town. He settled himself on the floor nearby, his back against the wall where he could see both the door and window. "Try to sleep," he told her. "Tomorrow we'll figure out our next move." But sleep proved elusive for both of them. Lorenzo dozed fitfully, starting awake at every creak of the old cabin's boards. Amara tossed and turned on the cot, murmuring prayers in a voice barely above a whisper. Near midnight, Henry came inside long enough to warm his hands by their tiny fire. "All quiet," he reported, "but there's riders moving in the valley. Can't tell who yet." Lorenzo nodded grimly. Baines wouldn't give up easily. The judge's pride wouldn't allow it, and more than that, he couldn't risk letting Amara stay free. She knew too much about his operation, about the other people he kept in bondage through forged papers and false debts. Dawn came pale and cold, seeping through the cabin's cracks like water. Henry prepared to leave, checking his rifle and gathering his thick winter coat around him. "I'll circle through town," he said quietly. "See what news I can gather. Maybe find out if any of Amara's proof survived the fire." "Be careful," Lorenzo warned. "They'll be watching for us." Henry's smile was slight but confident. "They'll be watching for a white man and a colored woman. They don't pay much mind to an old Indian." There was both bitterness and practical truth in his words. After he left, Lorenzo and Amara shared the last of their dried meat and hard bread. The food was scarce, but neither complained. They'd both known harder times. "What do you reckon they're doing now?" Amara asked softly, staring at the cabin's single window. "Searching every place they can think of," Lorenzo replied. "Baines won't stop until he finds us, or thinks we've fled the territory." "Could we? Flee, I mean?" Lorenzo considered it. "Mexico's not that far, or we could head north into Wyoming territory. Might be safer there." But Amara shook her head. "Running won't solve anything. He'll just keep doing this to others. There must be a way to stop him." "There might be." Lorenzo spoke carefully, not wanting to give false hope. "If we could find others he's wronged, gather enough witnesses." "It would be their word against his," Amara said bitterly. "And he's a judge." "Every man falls eventually," Lorenzo said. "Even judges, especially the ones who think they're above God's law." The day crept by with agonizing slowness. They spoke in whispers when they spoke at all, starting at every sound from outside. Lorenzo kept his rifle close, though he prayed he wouldn't have to use it. As evening approached, Amara suddenly gripped his arm. "Look." Through the window, they could see smoke rising in the distance, not the normal cooking fires of homesteads, but thick, angry columns that spoke of buildings burning. "They're searching cabins," Lorenzo said grimly, "burning them after to send a message." Amara's fingers dug into his arm. "All those people, losing their homes because of me." "Because of Baines," Lorenzo corrected firmly. "This is his sin, not yours. Remember that." She nodded, but tears filled her eyes again. Lorenzo found himself pulling her close, letting her bury her face against his chest as she wept. He stroked her hair gently, remembering how Sarah used to do the same for him when the memories of his cavalry days grew too heavy. "We'll make it right," he promised softly. "Somehow, we'll find a way to make it right." They stayed that way for a long time, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Outside, the smoke continued to rise, staining the sunset sky like sin staining a soul. But inside the cabin, something else was growing. A fragile trust, a shared faith that justice would prevail if they held true to what was right. As darkness fell, Lorenzo felt Amara's breathing even out. She had fallen asleep against him, exhaustion finally winning over fear. He didn't move, afraid to wake her. Instead, he began to pray, really pray for the first time since Sarah died. He asked for guidance, for protection, for the strength to see this through. But mostly, he thanked God for bringing this brave woman into his life, for showing him that even in the darkest times, love and faith could still grow. Henry hadn't returned by nightfall. Lorenzo tried not to worry. His friend knew how to move unseen, how to gather information without drawing attention. But as the hours crept by, concern gnawed at him like a hungry wolf. The smoke on the horizon had faded with the light, but its message lingered. Baines was showing his power, reminding everyone what happened to those who defied him. But he was also showing his fear. A truly powerful man wouldn't need such displays. Amara stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like a hymn. Lorenzo held her closer, silently renewing his vow to protect her. Whatever came next, whatever price they had to pay, he would see her free. Truly free. Not just in God's eyes, but in the eyes of the law as well. Outside, the wind picked up, making the old cabin creak and groan. But Lorenzo found he wasn't afraid anymore. Fear had been replaced by something stronger, a quiet certainty that they were on the right path, no matter how dark it seemed. God hadn't led them this far to abandon them now. He had to believe that. He began to hum softly, an old hymn his mother used to sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The words seemed to fill the cabin with peace, pushing back the shadows of doubt and fear. Amara's voice joined his, barely more than a whisper. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Together they waited for dawn, their faith growing stronger with each passing hour. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, trusting in something greater than themselves to light the way forward. Henry burst through the cabin door as the last light faded, clutching his side and breathing hard. Blood stained his jacket sleeve where thorns had caught him. Bad news, he gasped. Baines has turned the whole town against you, Lorenzo. Posted a $500 bounty for kidnapping and theft of property. His face twisted with disgust at the last words. Amara's hands trembled as she helped Henry to a chair. What can we do now? Lorenzo paced the small cabin, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. We need proof, real proof, and that means going to the source. He turned to face them both. We ride for Baines's ranch. There might be papers there or people willing to speak truth. As they hurriedly packed their meager supplies, hoofbeats approached through the darkness. 2 riders appeared in the yard, their shapes black against the starlit snow. Hello, the cabin, one called out. We're here to help. Heard you might need friendly faces. Lorenzo's hand moved to his rifle. Something in their voices rang false, too eager, too smooth. He'd heard that tone before, from men who made their living hunting others. The fight exploded in seconds. Lorenzo's first shot caught one bounty hunter in the leg as they kicked in the door. The second man's bullet found Henry's shoulder, spinning him against the wall. Amara screamed and threw a pot of hot coffee, buying them precious moments to escape through the back window. They ran into the forest, boots crunching in the snow. Behind them, angry shouts and gunfire split the night. Henry pressed a hand to his bleeding shoulder, but kept moving, his face set with determination. The 3 fugitives disappeared into the dark trees, bound together now by more than just purpose, bound by bloodshed and honor kept, by promises that couldn't be broken, no matter the price. Pink light crept across the eastern sky as Lorenzo and Henry finally collapsed beside a frozen creek. Their breath came in ragged clouds, their bodies spent from running through the night. Henry's shoulder wound had soaked through its makeshift bandage. Need water, Henry whispered, his skin burning with fever. Amara touched Lorenzo's cheek. I'll fill the canteens. She took their water skins and crept down to where the creek's ice had cracked, revealing dark water beneath. The deputies emerged like ghosts from the morning mist, rifles raised. Amara's heart seized as she saw them surround the clearing, their weapons trained on Lorenzo's back. He hadn't noticed them yet, too focused on checking Henry's wound. She knew in that moment what she had to do. Don't shoot! Amara stood slowly, raising her hands. I'll come quietly, just don't hurt them. Lorenzo's head snapped up at her voice. "Amara, no!" But she was already walking towards the deputies, her steps steady despite her trembling hands. "I'm the one you want. Let them be." Lorenzo lunged forward but froze as 3 rifles swung toward him. He could only watch, helpless, as they bound Amara's hands and dragged her away. Her eyes met his one last time, full of sorrow and something else, a fierce determination that broke his heart. Hours later, Lorenzo and Henry sat in adjacent cells in the Gunnison jail. Henry shivered with fever, but his voice was clear. "Don't give up, brother. She needs you now more than ever." Lorenzo gripped the iron bars until his knuckles went white. In the quiet of the cell, he bowed his head and prayed, his whispered words echoing off the stone walls. "Lord, give me strength. Help me find a way." 2 days dragged by like years in the Gunnison jail. Lorenzo's joints ached from the cold stone floor, but his heart ached more, wondering what horrors Amara might be facing back at the ranch. The click of boots on wooden boards made him look up. Mrs. Callahan stood before his cell, her face drawn with worry. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather hymn book. "This belonged to Dr. Holt," she whispered, glancing nervously at the empty sheriff's desk. "Amara's father left it with me years ago before the fever took him. I never thought to look inside until now." She carefully pulled back the book's binding. Folded yellowed papers slipped free. Lorenzo's hands trembled as he reached through the bars to take them. "The original Freedom Papers," Mrs. Callahan explained. "The judge kept them locked away all this time, thinking the doctor had hidden them in the courthouse. But God had other plans." Lorenzo sank to his knees, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "All this time," he whispered, "Lord's mercy was right there, waiting." Henry stirred in the next cell, his fever finally broken. "The sheriff won't help us, even with proof. Too scared of Baines." "Then we make our own justice," Lorenzo said, tucking the precious documents into his shirt. That night, when the moon vanished behind heavy clouds, they made their move. Henry had worked one iron bar loose using a hidden knife. With practiced silence, they slipped from their cells like shadows. The night air hit their faces like sweet freedom as they crept through the sleeping town. Lorenzo clutched the papers against his heart, each step carrying him closer to Amara. God's mercy had given them a second chance. Now they just had to reach her in time. Through swirling snow, Lorenzo and Henry spotted the orange glow against the night sky. Baines's sprawling ranch house loomed ahead, where flames from torch-bearing riders cast wild shadows across the yard. Drunken whoops and cruel laughter echoed as the men celebrated their victory. "They've got her in the barn," Henry whispered, pointing to the weathered structure where a lamp flickered in the loft window. "I will create confusion with the horses." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "God guide our hands." They split up, Henry creeping toward the corral while Lorenzo circled behind the barn. The sound of breaking glass and men singing covered his approach. His heart pounded as he scaled the rough boards to the loft. There she was, Amara, bound but unbroken, her eyes fierce in the lamplight. "Lorenzo," she breathed as he cut her free. Below, chaos erupted as Henry threw open the corral gates. Horses thundered past, scattering the drunken ranch hands. Shouts of alarm filled the night air. "Stop right there!" Judge Baines's voice cracked like a whip. He stood in the barn doorway, revolver shaking in his grip. "She's my property by law." Lorenzo helped Amara down the ladder, then turned to face the judge. Instead of drawing his gun, he pulled out the Freedom Papers, holding them high where the torchlight caught them. "No, sir, she ain't. Here's her father's certificate, signed and witnessed. She's free by law." Lorenzo's voice rang with quiet strength. "And by God." Baines's face twisted as he stared at the documents, his world crumbling before his eyes. The gun wavered in his trembling hand as the truth he'd tried to bury finally came to light. The timbers above them groaned as flames consumed the barn's roof. Baines's pistol remained leveled, his face a mask of hatred, even as burning debris rained down around them. "Your men are leaving you," Lorenzo said quietly, nodding toward the ranch hands who turned away one by one, shame written on their faces as they witnessed their master's madness. "Get out while you can!" Henry shouted from outside, clutching his wounded shoulder. The judge's eyes darted wildly as his world collapsed, both literally and figuratively. "If I can't have what's mine, none of us will," he snarled, stumbling backward into the inferno. His scream pierced the night as flames engulfed him. Lorenzo grabbed Amara's hand. "Run!" They burst through the barn doors just as the structure gave way with a thunderous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. In the snow-covered yard, Lorenzo pulled off his coat and wrapped it around Amara's trembling shoulders. Her eyes reflected the dying flames as he cupped her face in his calloused hands. "You're free now," he whispered. "Truly free." Tears streaked down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Henry approached, leading old Gus hitched to the blacksmith's wagon. "We need shelter for the night," he said, grimacing as he held his wound. They helped him into the wagon bed, where Lorenzo had laid fresh hay and blankets. As they rode away from the burning ranch, Amara tended Henry's injury, while Lorenzo guided the mule through moonlit snow. The wagon creaked softly as they made camp in a sheltered grove. The fire that had brought justice still glowed on the horizon, its light a reminder that God's mercy could shine even through darkness. Amara dozed against Lorenzo's shoulder, while Henry slept nearby. All three, souls bound together by providence and grace. The mountain passes opened like God's own gates as spring melted winter's grip. Where deep snow had once threatened Amara's life, tender grass now pushed through rich earth around Lorenzo's cabin. The transformation seemed nothing short of miraculous to them both. Amara knelt in the freshly turned soil beside the porch, her fingers gentle as she nestled sweet pea seedlings into their new home. The morning sun warmed her shoulders while she worked, and for the first time in years, she felt no need to look over her shoulder. Her father's hymns hummed softly on her lips as she patted the dark earth around each fragile plant. Lorenzo watched from where he split wood, his axe pausing mid-swing. The sight of her tending something so delicate, so full of promise, made his heart swell. These days, her movements carried a grace that spoke of healing, both in body and spirit. The clip-clop of hooves announced Henry's arrival. His left arm still hung in a sling, but his eyes sparkled with their old wisdom as he dismounted. "The Uncompahgre are moving to summer grounds," he said, accepting the cup of coffee Amara brought him. "I'll be joining them soon, but I wanted to see how the sweet peas grow first." They shared a simple meal of cornbread and beans, trading stories of the winter past as if it were a distant memory rather than mere weeks ago. Henry spoke of his people's ancient healing songs, and Amara's eyes grew bright with interest. She had begun collecting knowledge of both settler and native medicines, combining them with her own father's teaching. As afternoon lengthened toward evening, Henry rose to leave. "My arm grows stronger," he said, touching his healing shoulder, "like the land itself after winter." Amara embraced him carefully, mindful of his wound. "You'll always have family here," she whispered. Lorenzo clasped his friend's good hand. "Much obliged for everything, Henry. More than I can say." "The Great Spirit works in ways we don't expect," Henry replied with a knowing smile. They watched him ride away, until he disappeared into the greening aspens. Later, Lorenzo found Amara by the creek, where he'd first carried her through the snow. She sat with her father's Bible open in her lap, but her eyes followed the water's dance over stones. He settled beside her, their shoulders touching. The creek sang its endless song as shadow and light played across their faces. Amara's fingers traced the Bible's worn leather cover, touching the place where her father's name was etched. "I used to think God had forgotten me," she said softly, "but he was leading me here all along." Lorenzo took her hand, his thumb brushing over calluses earned from honest work rather than bondage. "When Sarah died," he said, "I lost my way, couldn't see past my own grief. Then I found you in the snow and—" He paused, overcome for a moment. "Well, reckon you did more healing of me than I ever did of you." Amara leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. The setting sun painted the sky in colors that reminded Lorenzo of the sweet peas she'd planted, pink and purple and gold. "It don't hurt anymore," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Not down there either." He pressed his free hand to his chest, where grief had lived so long. Amara's fingers tightened around his. "No," she agreed. "God's grace has made us new." They sat together as twilight softened the world, two souls who had found in each other the healing they thought impossible. Around them, wildflowers nodded in the evening breeze, where once there had been only snow, testament to the power of renewal and love's patient growth. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.